The record was filed under Administrative Action 7 Theta 9, not under war, not under conflict, not even under contested resource allocation. The Galactic Council, in its 37th session of the compliance rotation, had classified the dismantling of humanity's orbital defense network as a * clerical correction *. That detail alone should have warned them. Sensor specialist Vercombe noticed it first, not the silence where the human platforms had been, but the smell. The recycled atmosphere aboard the compliance vessel ordered patience carried something it hadn't carried before the grid came down. Something organic and sharp that the environmental systems couldn't quite neutralize. Vercombe had processed thousands of compliance operations across 41 species. He had never smelled anything like this aboard a human installation. He filed the anomaly under biological variance *. He did not mention it in his report. He would spend the rest of his life wishing he had. The Defense Grid Compliance Order had passed the Council's 7th chamber on what humans called a Tuesday, though the session record showed the vote finalized at 03:14 station time when the human observer delegates were asleep. 42 member species, 39 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 absence. The human delegation had not been informed until 6 hours after the vote was certified. Ambassador Lena Vasquez read the notification on a handheld device. Her aide watched her face and later told colleagues he had expected anger. Instead, she read the notification twice, set the device face down on the table and said, very quietly, "How long until the compliance vessels arrive?" 72 hours, Ambassador. Good, she said. She stood, straightened her jacket, and walked to the window overlooking the Council's central atrium. Then we have time. Her aide had no idea what she meant. He assumed it was diplomatic language, a negotiating posture, some human cultural expression of defiance that would soften into acceptance over the next 3 days. He was wrong, but then everyone was wrong about something in those first 72 hours. The stated justification was stability. In the Council's formal language, humanity's defense grid represented * unilateral escalatory infrastructure, a military capacity that exceeded what a probationary status species required for internal security. Earth had been a Council member for 11 years. Probationary status lasted a minimum of 30. The grid, they argued, was a provocation, a raised fist in a room full of outstretched hands. What the Council did not say, what existed only in the sealed deliberation transcripts that no human would access for another 4 years, was simpler. 17 of the 39 voting species had run independent threat projection models. All 17 models had returned the same result. Given humanity's observed behavioral patterns, technological absorption rate, and what the Torvahi Directorate had clinically labeled chronic psychological instability under pressure, the grid needed to come down before humans learned what they could actually do with it. That was the first mystery, not whether the Council feared humanity, but why they feared humanity already after only 11 years of contact. The second mystery was the smell on Vercombe's compliance vessel, but that one would take longer to unravel. The third was the backup. The compliance operation itself was unremarkable by Council standards. 4 vessels, 46 personnel from 7 species, 1 human liaison officer, required by the Provisional Contact Protocols, whose name was Sergeant First Class David Reyes, and who spent the entire 6-day operation sitting in a small observation alcove with a cup of coffee that he refilled from a thermos every 3 hours, watching the process with an expression Vercombe couldn't classify. Not grief, not rage, not the resigned acceptance Vercombe had observed in species who understood they had no options remaining. Something else, something still and attentive, the way a person looks when they are waiting for a specific moment that hasn't arrived yet. On the 3rd day, Vercombe sat across from him. "You understand," Vercombe began, choosing his words with care, that this action is not punitive. The Council. I know what the Council says, Reyes said. The lack of anger in his voice was more unsettling than anger would have been. Your government submitted no formal protest, Vercombe continued. Under the provisional protocols, you had 14 days to. We know the protocols. Vercombe paused, then why? Finish your work, specialist. Reyes refilled his coffee. We're not stopping you. Vercombe returned to his station. He wrote in his personal log that night, the human observer does not appear distressed by the dismantlement. He appears to be measuring something. I cannot determine what. He did not know what question to ask. He was not yet afraid enough to ask the right one. The grid came down in sections. The outer defense lattice first, 47 orbital platforms, each one carrying enough directed energy capacity to hold a contested approach corridor for 3 weeks against a mid-tier military fleet. Then the relay network, the targeting infrastructure, the subspace communication nodes hardwired specifically to the defense architecture. Finally, the 4 deep detection arrays that had been Earth's early warning system. The thing that would have given humanity 72 hours of notice before any serious threat could reach the inner system. Vercombe supervised the decommissioning of the last array personally. It was a massive structure, old by human standards, 12 years old, built before full Council contact, redesigned twice in the years since. The engineering team spent 9 hours removing its core systems, documenting each component per the compliance record. What no one noticed during those 9 hours was that the installation was 6 meters longer than the original blueprint. 6 meters on a 300-meter structure, a rounding error, a construction variance. Vercombe's team logged it without comment. Reyes in his alcove finally allowed himself a small breath. The Council received the compliance confirmation 14 days after the vote, certified complete, all primary defensive infrastructure dismantled, catalogued, and removed from Earth's operational capacity. The 7th Chamber recorded the action as closed. Ambassador Vasquez sent a formal acknowledgement, precisely worded, legally compliant, containing no objection and no concession. 3 of the Council's senior members interpreted this as evidence that humans were fundamentally pragmatic beneath the emotional volatility. They adjusted their threat projections downward. Councillor Drevansesh of the Torvahi Directorate did not adjust hers. She read Vasquez's acknowledgement 4 times and then called her security attaché. The wording, she said, read the 6th paragraph again. Her attaché read it. Earth affirms the removal of all primary defensive infrastructure as specified in Compliance Order 7 Theta 9 and acknowledges the Council's jurisdiction over orbital installations of the designated categories. Designated categories, Drevansesh said. Her attaché paused. That's standard acknowledgement language. Is it? Find me the original compliance order. Find me the exact definition of asterisk designated categories. It took her legal team 4 hours. When they returned, the lead analyst set his documents on her desk without speaking. He had underlined a single phrase in the compliance order's technical annex, orbital installations of Class 4 or above offensive designation, as classified under Council Armament Standard 7, Revision 3. Drevansesh sat very still. What's a Class 3 installation? She asked, though she already suspected. Defensive only. No offensive classification, not covered by the order. And Class 2. Infrastructure, communication, sensor, logistics. So anything they built to look asterisk like infrastructure would not have been subject to the compliance order at all. Drevansesh stood. Her office was on the 44th floor of the Council's administrative spire, and she walked to the window, and below her the atrium moved with the ordinary bureaucratic life of 42 civilizations maintaining order. How long, she said very carefully, have humans been members of this council? 11 years. And how long did it take them to read our armament classification standards? Her attaché checked. The standards were shared with the human delegation during initial onboarding, year 1. She closed her eyes. 10 years. Humans had known for 10 years exactly what the compliance order would and would not cover, and they had built accordingly. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she didn't know yet. The worst part was the backup that hadn't been found because no one had thought to look for something that had never been declared, never been registered, never been built under any designation the council had a word for. She sent a priority message to her surveillance division that night. Conduct a full-spectrum survey of human near space. All frequencies, all object classes, minimum resolution. Do it now. She did not explain why. She did not want to be the one who had to say it out loud yet. The survey results came back in 48 hours. Her lead analyst delivered them in person, which was the first sign. He set the report on her desk and remained standing. "What am I looking at?" she said. "We're not certain. The readings are consistent with debris fields." Debris. 17 of them, distributed across Earth's L4 and L5 Lagrange points, the trailing lunar orbit zone, and several locations within the asteroid resource corridor that humans opened for mining operations 6 years ago. Defenseless looked at the spectral analysis. At first, she saw what her analyst had described. Scattered materials, metallic compounds, irregular mass distributions, the kind of spatial clutter that accumulated around any industrialized inner system. Then she looked at the density patterns. "These aren't random distributions," she said. "No, they're quite precisely irregular. The randomness is consistent across all 17 fields." Consistent randomness. Yes, which is statistically impossible, she leaned back, unless someone made them look random. Her analyst nodded. He had been working in council surveillance for 22 years. She watched his face and understood that he had not come to deliver a report. He had come because he was frightened. "Run a resonance analysis," she said. "Deep cycle. I want to know if those fields are broadcasting anything." "At what frequency?" She thought about the 6 meters of unexplained length in the compliance report. She thought about the smell Vercombe had noted in his anomaly log, which she had read because she read every anomaly log from every human-adjacent operation. She thought about Ambassador Vasquez's precise, compliant, legally airtight acknowledgement. All of them, she said, start at the lowest. She was not prepared for what they found. Nothing in her career had prepared her for what they found. And she had spent 30 years preparing for human surprises, because the Torvahi Directorate had understood earlier than most that humans were the kind of species that warranted preparation. The debris fields were broadcasting. Not on any council standard frequency, not on any frequency in the Galactic Communication Registry, on a frequency that, as far as her technical team could determine, had never been used by any spacefaring civilization in recorded history, because it was extraordinarily inefficient, suffering severe signal degradation across any distance greater than 3 light minutes, unless the receivers were already within 3 light minutes. Distributed throughout 17 debris fields, precisely positioned to cover every viable approach corridor to Earth's inner system. "They hit a sensor network," her analyst said. He said it the way a person states something they need to hear themselves say. "They hit it inside asterisk debris fields they manufactured to look like natural accumulation," Defenseless said. "Over what time frame?" He checked. His hand was slightly unsteady. "The earliest spectral aging we can confirm on the camouflage materials is 9 years, 8 months. 9 years, 8 months. Humans had begun constructing their hidden sensor network approximately 3 months after receiving the Council's armament classification standards. They weren't waiting for us to take the grid down. Defenseless said slowly. They built the backup before they built the grid. The grid was what they showed us. Her analyst sat down. He did this without asking permission, which told her more about the moment than anything else. The compliance operation, he said. We were removing the sacrifice piece, she said. The piece they built for us to find. The silence between them was the silence of a very large realization arriving in a very small room. She made 3 calls in the next hour. The first was to her surveillance division. Cease all active scanning of human near space immediately. She didn't want them to know what had been found. The second was to the Council's legal chamber, requesting a private review of Compliance Order 7 Theta 9's full technical annex. The third was to her most trusted colleague on the Council, a senior counselor from the Marin continuity named Physician Advocate Solis Veen, who had been one of the 2 abstentions in the original vote. You abstained, Defenseless said when Solis Veen answered. Why? A pause. You're asking me now, 3 weeks after. Yes. Another pause longer. Because, Solis Veen said carefully, I read their history files, all of them, not the summary reports. The primary sources our translation division compiled. And every time a human civilization in their own history was stripped of its defenses through political pressure, they did one of 2 things. They collapsed, or they built something they didn't tell anyone about. Defenseless closed her eyes, and you couldn't tell which kind these were. I knew which kind they were. That's why I abstained. I didn't think 39 of my colleagues should vote for the order without understanding what they might be creating. Why didn't you say so? The pause this time was so long she wondered if the connection had dropped. Because, Solis Veen finally said, I was not certain anyone would believe me. Humans had been members for 11 years and had not yet done anything the threat projection models predicted. It is very difficult to tell a chamber full of experienced diplomats that a species is dangerous specifically, because they haven't shown you how dangerous they are yet. Defenseless thought about Sergeant Reyes watching the compliance operation with his cup of coffee, refilling it every 3 hours, measuring something she hadn't known to look for. I need to meet with Vasquez, she said. That would be unwise right now. Why? Because, Solis Veen said, and now there was something almost sorrowful in her voice. If you meet with her, she will know we found it. And right now, the one advantage we have is that she doesn't know we know. The moment she knows. She already knows, Defenseless said. A sharp silence. How? Because we ran an active scan of their near space. Active scans emit. Any decent sensor network would have detected our survey. She breathed out slowly. She's known we found it for about 36 hours. She's been waiting to see what we do with the information. Solis Veen was quiet for a long time. Then, she said at last, we are not investigating humans. We are being observed by them. Ambassador Vasquez received the Council's request for a private meeting with the Torvahi Directorate Senior Representative on a Thursday afternoon. She read it, handed it to her aide and said, tell them Friday morning. Early. Should I ask what it's regarding? I know what it's regarding. She looked out the window at the Council atrium. Get me Reyes. I want to debrief him before the meeting. Reyes came in at 1700. He sat down, accepted the coffee she poured him, and waited. They found the sensor net, she said. He nodded. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look relieved either. He looked the same way he'd looked in the observation alcove on the compliance vessel, attentive and still. How much of it, he asked. Enough to understand what it is. Maybe not enough to understand what it does. They'll want to know if there's more. Yes. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Is there? She met his eyes. What do you think? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I think when they took the grid down, they expected us to be frightened, or angry, or to protest. They didn't expect us to already have a plan for the moment exactly like this one. He set down the cup. That's 3 things they've gotten wrong about us. 4, she said. He raised an eyebrow. They think the backup is the sensor network. The question appeared in his eyes before he voiced it. The sensor network, Vasquez said carefully, is the backup to the backup. Ray sat very still, then quietly, how long have we? Since year 3. She stood and moved to the window. The grid was real. The sensor network is real. But both of them were built on the assumption that someday we'd be in a room with a very powerful group of people who had just made a very serious mistake. And we'd need to have a conversation about what happens next. She watched the atrium below. Tomorrow, we have that conversation. And if they don't respond well. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the specific silence of a person who has considered every answer and chosen not to speak any of them aloud. Then we find out, she said, what year 4 was for. The Friday meeting was requested as a bilateral session. It became, within 4 hours, a full emergency session of the Council's Security Continuity Committee, 7 senior representatives, legal counsel, the head of the Council's Military Liaison Division, and because the protocols required it, a human observer. That observer was Vasquez herself. She entered the chamber in a dark blue jacket she had worn to every significant meeting since her first year as ambassador. Her aide had once asked about it. She had told him she wore it because it was comfortable. This was not entirely true. She wore it because in 11 years, no council representative had ever been able to read the emblem on the lapel, a small, specific image that meant something to approximately 12 billion people and nothing to anyone in that room. She waited. Vasquez opened the session with unusual directness. We have detected infrastructure in your near space that was not included in the compliance operations inventory. Yes, Vasquez said. The room was not expecting agreement. A small disruption passed through it, the alien equivalent of a collective flinch. You acknowledge it? Yes. Then you understand, Vasquez said carefully, that we may be required to classify this as a violation of the compliance order. You may attempt to. Vasquez set her hands flat on the table, a gesture she had learned communicated calm containment across most of the species in the room. However, I'd suggest reviewing the compliance order's technical annex first, specifically the definition of designated categories and specifically what Class 2 infrastructure includes. Another disruption in the room, smaller. Some of them had already read it. Vasquez studied her. You built a sensor network and classified it as mining support infrastructure. We built a sensor network, Vasquez agreed, using methods and frequencies not covered by Council Armament Standard 7, Revision 3, and installed it within proximity of existing licensed mining operations, which are classified as Class 2 infrastructure under the standard you wrote. The intent was clearly. Counselor, Vasquez's voice didn't change temperature. Intent is not defined in your compliance framework. That's not a criticism. It's a legal observation. If you'd like to amend the framework, we would be happy to participate in that process. Vasquez recognized what she was doing. She was, very calmly, offering them a way to proceed that required renegotiation rather than confrontation. She was also, in the same breath, making clear that she had read their legal framework closely enough to drive a sensor network through it. Ambassador, Vasquez said, and now something shifted in her approach, something that was less adversarial and more careful. I want to understand something, off the formal record. Vasquez looked at the recording indicator on the table, looked at Vasquez. You'll need to actually turn off the record. Vasquez turned off the record. 3 months after we joined the council, Vasquez said, before Vasquez could speak, one of our analysts flagged a pattern in your armament standards. The classification structure had 17 distinct gaps, areas where defensive or dual-use infrastructure could be deployed without triggering any existing compliance mechanism. We did not create those gaps. We found them. She paused. Our analysts spent the following 3 months verifying that the gaps were real, not traps. Then we spent 9 years building within them. Because you anticipated the compliance order, Defenseless said. Because we read your history the same way your colleague Solis Veen read ours, a beat. Every dominant institution in your council's history has, at some point, moved to limit the capacity of a rising member species. It's not malicious. It's structural. You do it because you believe it ensures stability. We understand that. She held Defenseless's gaze. We just prepared for it. The room was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recalibration. What else? Said the military liaison, Commandant Scholar Prethaliv, who had not spoken until now. Did you build that we haven't found? Vasquez looked at him. The question was direct. She gave it the weight it deserved. I'm not going to answer that, she said, but I'll tell you something more useful. She looked around the table. You took our grid down because 17 of your member species ran threat projections and determined we were a risk. I'd like to know what those projections were based on. Defenseless glanced at the legal counsel. A small confirmation passed between them. Then, behavioral modeling. Your species observed patterns under stress, escalation rates, psychological variance under extended pressure. The models determined that a species with your profile, given sufficient military capacity, would represent a statistically significant destabilization risk within 2 council generations. And now, Vasquez asked. Defenseless paused. The models haven't been rerun. Run them again, Vasquez said. With the new data, then bring me the results. She stood, which signaled the end of the conversation more effectively than any formal motion. Because I think you'll find that what your models actually identified wasn't aggression. She picked up her jacket lapel with 2 fingers and showed them the emblem, the small image that meant everything and nothing, depending on whether you knew what you were looking at. None of them knew. She let it fall. What your models identified, she said, is a species that doesn't stop building when it's frightened. That's not the same thing as dangerous. She moved toward the door. Though I understand why you might find it hard to tell the difference. She was 3 steps into the corridor when Prethaliv appeared behind her. He had moved fast for his size, which told her he'd been waiting for her to leave the room before asking what he actually wanted to know. The backup, he said, low, not a question. She stopped, didn't turn. The sensor network, he said, is not the main installation. Your ambassador's response pattern in there, you were comfortable. Too comfortable for someone who had been caught. You were comfortable because being caught was acceptable. That means there's something that being caught doesn't compromise. She turned, looked at him steadily. You spent 9 years building inside our legal gaps, he said. What were you building toward? She considered him. She had been told by people who'd worked with the Torvahi for decades that their military officers were the species' most perceptive individuals, selected specifically for their capacity to find patterns in behavior that their civilian counterparts missed. She had been told this, and she had believed it, and she was now looking at the evidence. Commandant, she said quietly, the question you should be asking isn't what we built. The question is why your legal framework had 17 gaps in the first place. His eyes shifted, a micro-expression she recognized as the alien equivalent of a person realizing they've been standing on the wrong side of a door. Our frameworks were developed over 400 years, he said slowly, by dozens of member species collaborating on the assumption, she said, that the gaps would never need to be closed because no species would be patient enough to find all 17, verify they were real rather than traps, and then spend 9 years quietly building inside them without triggering a single monitoring flag. She watched understanding move across his face. Your frameworks were designed for species that think in terms of decades. We planned in terms of decades, too. We just planned further into the decade than you expected." She turned and walked to the end of the corridor. He did not follow. She did not tell him what year 4 was for. She would not tell anyone yet what year 4 was for. But as she walked, she thought about the people who had spent 8 years after the sensor network was complete doing something quieter, something that required no infrastructure at all, no orbital installations, no frequencies, no debris fields, something built entirely in the minds of 12 billion people who had grown up learning 2 things simultaneously: how to be good council members and how to survive in a galaxy where good council membership might someday not be enough. She thought about the 11 million children currently enrolled in deep space survival curriculum, the 300,000 engineers with dual specialties in council standard systems, and the theoretical alternatives to every piece of council standard infrastructure. The 47 research programs running in parallel in the identified gaps of council knowledge. Gaps humans had been cataloging for 11 years with the same quiet, systematic patience they'd used to find the gaps in the legal framework. None of it was in any military registry. None of it was classified as a threat. It was, by every council standard, simply education, development, a species maturing into its membership. She thought about what defenseless rerun threat projections were going to say when they returned. She thought about the face of the analyst who would deliver them. She thought about Ray's in his alcove, refilling his thermos, measuring something no one had known to look for. The threat projections came back in 6 days. Defenseless reviewed them alone at 300 station time, in her office, with the lights down, because she had known since requesting them what they were likely to say, and she had wanted to be alone when she read it. The models had been updated with the new behavioral data, the analysis of the sensor network's construction timeline, the legal framework navigation, the compliance operation response pattern, the Friday meeting dynamics. The revised threat projection was 23 pages. The summary was 1 sentence. This species does not become more dangerous under pressure. It becomes more organized. She set the document down. Through her window, the council atrium was empty at this hour, and the spire's lights threw long geometric shadows across the floor. She thought about what it meant, not for her security modeling, not for the council's compliance framework, but for something larger and harder to classify. A species that responded to having its defenses removed by building better ones. That responded to having its capacity limited by finding new capacity. That had spent 11 years learning the shape of a system, not to attack it, but to live inside it so thoroughly that the system could not safely move against them without revealing every gap in itself. Not aggression, not resistance, something more patient than either. She pulled up the file on Ambassador Vasquez, the full file, not the diplomatic summary. The childhood education records that the initial contact team had compiled because they compiled everything. The early career documents, the personal history. There was a photograph, dated from before council contact. Vasquez was young in it, very young, maybe 8 years old. She was standing in front of a building that the file identified as a school. She was holding something, a book, an actual printed book, which humans had continued producing long after digital alternatives were standard, a fact that had struck several contact linguists as economically irrational. Defenseless enlarged the image enough to read the book's title. The translation system struggled, rendered it phonetically, something about stars. She closed the file. She sat in the dark. She thought about 8-year-old humans reading books about stars and growing up to spend 9 years building invisible sensor networks inside an alien legal framework before the need for them had even officially existed. She thought about what kind of species read about stars before they could reach them, and what kind of species, upon finally reaching them, immediately began planning for the possibility that the stars might one day need to be defended. She did not sleep that night, Vasquez received Dreven-Sesh's private communique at 600. No formal channel, no legal counsel copied, just a message from one person to another that read, "I would like to continue our conversation from Friday. Off record as before. I have a question that is not in my professional interest to ask officially." Vasquez read it, wrote back, "Same terms tomorrow." She set down her device and looked at Reyes, who had arrived with her morning briefing and was now watching her face with the same patient attention she'd spent 11 years cultivating in her delegation. "Dreven-Sesh," she said, "she's not going to escalate." "You sure?" "She's a threat projector. She ran the new models and understood what they mean." Vasquez poured her coffee. "She's not scared of what we built. She's scared of what we asterisk are." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Is that better or worse?" She thought about year 4. She thought about 11 million children and 47 research programs and 300,000 engineers. She thought about the 12 billion people who had, without ever being asked directly, without any formal program or official directive, simply decided, collectively, quietly, with the specific stubbornness of a species that had survived its own history, that they would not be the kind of civilization that could be made helpless by paperwork. "It's honest," she said, "that's what it is." Dreven-Sesh arrived at the private meeting room early. Vasquez arrived exactly on time, which Dreven-Sesh had begun to recognize as a human way of indicating that punctuality was a choice rather than a response. They sat, no recording indicators, no legal counsel, no formal language. "My question," Dreven-Sesh said, "is this. If we had not taken the grid down, would you have built the sensor network anyway?" Vasquez looked at her for a long moment. Then, yes. "Why?" "Because we read your history. Every dominant institution eventually moves to limit a rising member. We didn't build the backup because we were afraid of you specifically. We built it because we understood the structure." She paused. "The grid was our public defense. The sensor network was our private one. If the grid had never been touched, the sensor network would still exist, and you still wouldn't have found it, and we would still be sitting in council sessions being very good probationary members. And the other things," Dreven-Sesh said carefully, "that Prethaliv believes exist. He's perceptive. Are they a threat to the council?" Vasquez considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "That depends entirely on the council." She leaned forward slightly. "We are not trying to dominate this institution. We are not trying to replace it. We are trying to be in it as genuinely as we can, while also ensuring that being in it doesn't mean we can be made to disappear from it." She held Dreven-Sesh's gaze. "Every species at your table built something before they got there. Ours just kept building after we arrived." Dreven-Sesh was quiet for a long time. Outside, the atrium was filling with the ordinary motion of a morning session. "What does the emblem mean?" she asked finally. "On your jacket, the one you showed us." Vasquez looked down at her lapel, at the small image that meant everything to 12 billion people. "It's from an old Earth saying," she said, "from before we had any of this, before space, before contact, before the council, from a time when we didn't have any of the advantages we have now." She smoothed the fabric. "It means we have not yet begun to fight." The silence that followed was not alarming, not hostile, not the silence of an ultimatum. It was something Dreven-Sesh had no clean category for, the silence of a very old civilization suddenly understanding that a much younger one had been sitting next to it for 11 years, with a depth of preparation that made the older civilization feel, for the first time in centuries, genuinely uncertain about the future. Not afraid, not yet. But aware, in a way she hadn't been the day before. That uncertainty about humans and certainty about humans had always felt identical right up, until the moment they were not. She left the meeting and walked to her office and sat down and looked at the atrium and thought about what the council's formal historians would eventually write about this period, whether they would call it the moment humanity announced itself, or the moment humanity was discovered already having announced itself, years before anyone knew to listen. She thought the distinction mattered. She wasn't sure why yet. She pulled up the threat projection document, the one-sentence summary. Read it again. This species does not become more dangerous under pressure. It becomes more organized. She thought about 39 votes. She thought about the compliance operation filed under *clerical correction*. She thought about 6 meters of unexplained length in a blueprint, about 17 debris fields that looked like nothing, about a sensor network broadcasting on a frequency no one had ever used because it was useless at any distance greater than 3 light minutes, built by a species that had positioned receivers exactly 3 light minutes away. She thought about 8-year-old Lena Vasquez holding a book about stars. She thought about what kind of species reads about something before it can touch it, and then, upon touching it, immediately begins planning for the moment someone might try to take it away. She did not add a note to the formal record. She did not file a revised threat assessment. She did not schedule another session. She did one thing. She sent a private message to every member of the Security Continuity Committee. No subject line, no formal preamble, just a question. When we wrote the compliance order, when we identified the gaps in the framework, did any of us ask why they were there? No one answered that day. No one answered the next. 3 weeks later, Prethalev sent a single line. We assumed no species would be patient enough to look. She looked at that message for a long time in the quiet of her office, 44 floors above the atrium where 42 civilizations went about the ordinary business of an organized galaxy, all of them believing, at varying levels of certainty, that they understood the newest members at the table. Outside, somewhere in the debris fields of the L4 and L5 points, in the trailing shadows of a Moon No Council vessel had reason to examine closely, in the carefully ordinary signal noise of 17 manufactured fields that looked exactly like nothing, something waited. Something that had been waiting for 9 years and 8 months, and would continue waiting with the specific, geological patience of a species that had learned, long before it reached the stars, that the most dangerous moment was not when someone took something from you. The most dangerous moment was when they believed you had nothing left. Humanity, it turned out, had never been particularly good at believing that about themselves. And in a galaxy full of civilizations advanced enough to model every threat, predict every escalation, and classify every danger, not one of them had thought to model for a species that simply refused to accept the model's premise. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the oldest. Their technology was borrowed at the edges and built from scratch at the center. Their emotional volatility was real, their history was violent, and their psychology was, by every clinical metric, unstable under extended pressure. But they had been reading about the stars since they were children. And they had never, not once, stopped playing